Welcome back to Games with Dad. I'm your host, Dad, and this month I want to talk about a genre of games that I grew up alongside. You see, the excess violence and attitude of the 1980s came to a head in the early 90s, and soon afterwards, the first-person shooter as we know it was born. Sure, there were earlier examples like Atari's 1980 arcade hit Battlezone, but the 1990s finally gave us the technology and the know-how to create complex levels, and is there anything more immersive than looking directly behind the barrel of a gun? There's a certain charm to these early shooters. The mechanics can often feel somewhat raw and occasionally dated, but the games themselves aren't bogged down by unnecessary features. Cutscenes are few and far between, so the focus is almost always on the action. And for a while, there was an unfilled need for games like these, and many gamers look back fondly on the shooters of yore, bequeathing unto them the most prestigious title, Boomer Shooter. Then a bunch of these nerds that missed playing these games ended up making titles in the same vein as these, like Dusk, and now the genre is arguably more popular than it's ever been. So this month I'd like to take some time and celebrate the ones that started it all. Here's some of my favorite classic shooters. But before we get started, let's set some ground rules. Number 1. No games after 2004. And this might frustrate some people, but in my opinion, classic shooters end around the 2004 mark. This is right before the Xbox 360 generation, which was a giant leap forward for shooters, both in terms of fidelity and design. There is a huge difference in the average shooter made in 2004 and the average shooter made in 2006. Number 2. Only one game per franchise. Otherwise, this list is going to be almost all id Software titles. Sure, rocket scientist, computer wizard, and all-around computer Jesus, John Carmack, is responsible for some of the greatest games and humongous technological leaps forward in our lifetimes, but he can't hog all the limelight. Number 3. This is my list, and I made it for fun. You might not agree with me, and that's frankly okay. I encourage you to make your own list and discuss in the comments below. Alright, with the rules out of the way, get psyched. Here we go. Number 10, Quake. You know there are a lot of all-time classics on this list if Quake is this far down on the totem pole. A lot of people point to 1996 as the year that 3D gaming really arrived, and Quake thrust the PC community headfirst into polygons, vertices, and online deathmatch. One of the most important games ever made, Quake paved the way for fully 3D action games. If you've played an FPS in the past 20 years, chances are that planted deep within that game's bowels is some of
benevolent architect of the post-singular simulation,
John Carmack's code. HalfLife, Call of Duty, and honestly, any game with working online multiplayer all owe their existence to Quake. So if it's so important, why is it only number 10 on the list? Simple. I don't like playing it as much as the others. Because you couldn't fit that many enemies on screen in 96, it had to pump up the HP values on most enemies, and it makes them feel a little too tanky for my tastes. I still love playing it, but I don't really enjoy the rhythm of the combat as much as the other games on this list. So, what's better than Quake? 2 teams, 64 players, tanks, boats, and planes. Throw it all together, and you get my favorite game from 2002, Battlefield 1942. Hitting right in the middle of that post-Saving Private Ryan World War II shooter boom, Battlefield became one of the must-play games back in the early 2000s. It skipped past the linear story-based missions of its peers and instead decided to focus on massive combat arenas. And although much slower than the multiplayer found in games like Quake and Doom, Battlefield one-upped its peers by focusing on sheer size and spectacle. It doubled the size found in contemporary games like Unreal Tournament, and it required players to pick from one of 5 specialized classes, just like in Team Fortress. Fun fact, this was the first online PC game I ever played. Special thanks to my cousin's boyfriend, now husband, Phil, for taking the time to teach me the ropes back in the day. Thanks, Phil. The sheer player counts and giant vehicular sandbox was a recipe for success, and the series is still going on fairly strong despite some more recent bumps in the road. Come get some! Everyone knows about Duke. Beloved by many and chastised by, well, just about as many, Duke 3D was the first of the Holy Build Engine trilogy composed of the aforementioned Duke 3D, Shadow Warrior, and Blood, and then they were all eclipsed when Ion Fury came out in 2019. Anyways, renowned for its quick explosive action, stolen action hero quips, and surprisingly realistic level design, Duke 3D is a fantastic game. The arsenal is creative. I mean, sure, you've got your standard pistol, shotgun, and rocket launcher, but you also get remote detonated pipe bombs, a freeze thrower, and even a shrink ray. But remember, just because it's old doesn't mean that it's easy. The Build Engine trilogy is notoriously difficult, and honestly, the only reason that Blood and Shadow Warrior are on here is because I am hilariously bad at them, especially Blood. For many, Duke 3D was the pinnacle of the over-the-top 80s action movie violence in video game form, but as for me, let's say I always preferred the next game on this list. Although nowhere near as prestigious as Duke, Sirius Sam is kooky, frantic, and cruel in ways that are truly unique. I mean, look at the first secret in the game. You immediately get attacked by rocket mechs with nothing more to defend yourself than pistols. The sheer spectacle and size of the enemy hordes is stupefying. Instead of trying to create intricately detailed levels or giant multiplayer maps, the geniuses over at Crow Team thought,
Well, what if we just threw like 300 dudes at you?
the balance of each enemy type is actually well done for the most part. Take for instance my favorite enemy in Sirius Sam, the Werebull. This giant monstrosity does nothing but gun it right for you, and he hits like a truck, so you'll most likely want to take him out quickly, because if you don't, and you get distracted by another group of enemies, you're likely to get speared in the back. Sirius Sam force feeds you the need for target prioritization and circle strafing. I wouldn't recommend marathoning it, as it does get a little long in the tooth, but it's still a thrill ride when taken in smaller chunks over time. Oh yeah, here we go. Goldeneye multiplayer is where the 4th graders became men. My first ever all-nighter playing video games was Goldeneye back in April of 2000 with a room full of my friends. Alec kept using Oddjob, Preston was trying to figure out how to crouch, and Adam wouldn't stop camping with proximity mines. Goldeneye is fantastic, but if you want more, I really can't recommend Perfect Dark enough. The single-player missions are much more varied and creative. The weapons are much more exotic and not tied down by reality or the Bond license. And the multiplayer was even better. One of the first games I ever played that let you use bots to play against. Be warned though, these games can get hard even if you're playing with modern controls. Copies of Goldeneye can be pretty difficult to track down nowadays, but I can definitely recommend the Perfect Dark remaster available on the Xbox 360, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X. Toward the end of the 90s, shooters started to develop a problem. They weren't moving forward at quite the same rate that they had been back in the early 90s. Hell, even id Software went back to their Space Marine roots for Quake 2. Shooters needed a shakeup, and that's exactly what happened in November of 1998. Valve's HalfLife was a game changer. Forgoing the maze-like designs of games like Quake and Turok, Half-Life was a rocket-propelled roller coaster that was on one continuous experience, only broken up by the occasional loading screen. Others may say Half-Life 2 is the better game, and honestly, for the most part, I would agree with them. But I do enjoy the pacing of the combat in the original Half-Life more, as well as admiring the giant leap forward that it was at the time. It also gave birth to the next entry on this list. Let's get this out of the way. I am bad at CounterStrike, which, considering the amount of time I put into it my freshman year of college, is kinda really embarrassing. It's a tale as old as time, really. 2 teams, one trying to protect an objective and one trying to attack it. The better you do, the more cash you earn to spend on buying weapons and gear. CounterStrike rewards strategy, teamwork, and steady hands. It's a formula that has worked so well that it's gone relatively unchanged since the original release back in 2000. The footage here is from CounterStrike Source, the version that I played the most in college. What I love most about CounterStrike is all the crazy custom game types you come across. In just a few minutes I was able to find a standard server, a server running surf maps, and one with a zombie game with crazy maps and things like flying platforms. CounterStrike can be anything you want it to be, and that's why I like it so much. Number 3, from the original team that created Goldeneye comes 2002's Time Splitters 2. It is, in my opinion, the Goldeneye formula perfected. The action is terrific, the weapons feel great, and there's more game types than you'll know what to do with. The premise is unique too. There's all this commotion about going back in time to stop this evil alien race from conquering the world, but really it's all an excuse to have a ton of different characters, a variety of settings, and more interesting guns than anything else on this list. The single player is fantastic, but the multiplayer is probably my favorite from that era other than Super Smash Bros. Melee, and that's saying something. I rented this one so often that my parents got mad at me. If they knew I was going to like this game this much, they probably would have just bought it for me. And if there was ever a game that needs a re-release, it's Time Splitters 2. The granddaddy of the modern shooter and arguably the most important shooter made in the last 20 years, Halo 2 was one of the first blockbuster game releases that I remember getting excited for. It was one of the first major releases that made every other industry stop and ask, how did games suddenly get this big? It was making more money than giant Hollywood epics, and for good reason. Everything from the first game has been tightened up. The single player, rush ending and all, has really good pacing and also lets you play as a disgraced elite that eventually ends up teaming up with humanity to try and save the galaxy. The multiplayer was the major step up, however. I mean, for crying out loud, the Nintendo Switch still has worse online support than Halo 2, a game that came out in 2004. It did everything right. Skill-based and social matchmaking, friend invites, voice chat in-game, custom matches. It set the standard for what we expect for an online shooter. It was a legitimate game changer, and it shifted the industry towards what we have today. So what beats out a game as prolific as Halo 2? But before we get to that, let's talk about some games that I love that just didn't make the list. Big shoutouts to literally anything Raven Software has ever put out. My favorites from this era being Jedi Knight 2, Jedi Outcast, Hexen, Heretic, and Soldier of Fortune. Return to Castle Wolfenstein is obviously great, but I haven't spent enough time with it. Same goes for the Marathon series. I've beaten Durandal, but that was well over 10 years ago. Chex Quest was the first-person shooter that I ever beat, and Turok 1 and 2 are fantastic games, but also really confusing and maze-like, which puts me off a little bit. So anyways, where were we? Honestly, no other game stood a chance. My favorite is Doom, and it will most likely always be Doom. The speed, the combat, the resource management. Hey guys, look, I beat Hell Beneath and I didn't even die. The ability to turn it into whatever the hell you want it to be. It is the godfather of first-person shooters. Any shooter that has come after must pay their respects to Doom. It's a classic in every sense of the word. So much so that for my birthday next month, I'm dedicating an entire episode just to Doom. So stay tuned.